were not falling behind. You were being protected from something most people never even realized destroyed them. There is a specific kind of person who spends their 20s and 30s feeling wrong. Not broken, not lazy, not stupid, just wrong. Like they are wearing a life that does not quite fit, like everyone else received a manual they never got. And the loneliest part of this feeling is that the world has no language for it. The world only has a stopwatch. But Carl Jung spent decades studying exactly this kind of person. And what he discovered will permanently change the way you understand your own timeline. Because the people who bloom after 40 do not just bloom late, they bloom differently. And they all share one thing in common that almost no one ever talks about. The first thing you need to understand is that the modern world has built its entire reward system around the wrong definition of readiness. We celebrate the person who figures it out early, the 24-year-old with the startup, the 28-year-old with the book deal, the 30-year-old with the house and the career and the marriage that photographs well. We treat this early configuration as the goal, as proof of intelligence, as evidence that someone has their life together. But Jung looked at these people in his clinical work and he saw something that deeply troubled him. He saw people who were performing a life rather than living one. He had a name for what they were doing. He called it building the persona. The persona in Jungian psychology is not simply a mask you put on consciously. It is something far more insidious. It is the identity you construct under pressure, under the weight of parental expectation and social approval and economic necessity and the overwhelming human need to belong somewhere. The persona is assembled in pieces over years, a grade here, an approval there, a job title that makes people at dinner parties stop asking uncomfortable questions. And the terrifying thing about the persona is that the better it works, the more dangerous it becomes. Because a mask that works too well becomes indistinguishable from the face underneath. You forget you are wearing it. You forget there is a face underneath it all. The person who figures everything out at 25 has often done something that looks like success but functions like a trap. They have fused their entire sense of worth to external results, and this works. It works spectacularly. Until one morning in their 40s they wake up and realize that everything they built was built on borrowed blueprints, that the life they are living was designed by someone else's idea of what a life should look like. Jung watched this collapse happen over and over in his office. Patients would arrive not at 25 broken by failure, they arrived at 45 broken by success. They had everything, and they felt nothing. That is not a coincidence, that is a pattern. Now here is where it gets interesting. The person who feels behind at 35 or 40 or 45. The person who has not figured it out yet. That person is not failing. In many cases that person is refusing. Something inside them will not cooperate with the borrowed blueprint. Something keeps saying this does not fit. And the world interprets this refusal as confusion, as lack of ambition, as being lost. But Jung interpreted it as something else entirely. He called it the beginning of individuation. Individuation is the process by which a person stops becoming what the world needs them to be and starts becoming what they actually are. It is not comfortable, it is not linear. It does not happen on a schedule that looks good on a resume. Individuation is the slow, painful excavation of an authentic self from underneath decades of accumulated expectation. And it cannot begin in earnest until the provisional personality, the draft version of you assembled under pressure, starts to crack. James Hollis, who spent decades as a Jungian analyst, described this draft version as the provisional personality. He argued that the self you build in the first half of your life is not really you. It is a functional prototype. It gets you through school. It gets you through your first relationships. It helps you survive the social ecosystem you were born into. And then if you are lucky, and this is the part most people miss, if you are lucky it starts to crack. Because the crack is not the failure. The crack is the invitation. The crack is the moment your authentic self begins pushing through the constructed one. Most people patch the crack. They chase harder, they buy more. They double down on the old identity because dismantling what you built feels like dying. But the late bloomer, the person who blooms after 40, is the person who does not patch the crack. They walk through it. The one thing that every late bloomer shares is not talent, it is not intelligence, it is not even passion in the Instagram sense of the word. It is a high tolerance for the discomfort of becoming. It is the capacity to sit in an unfinished identity without collapsing into the first available exit. Rich Carlson, in his research on late blooming lives, documented this trait consistently across hundreds of subjects. Late bloomers share high curiosity combined with a low tolerance for inauthenticity. They cannot fake it long enough to coast. They cannot settle for a life that feels fundamentally wrong even when that life looks perfectly fine from the outside. This is not a weakness. This is the psyche protecting something precious. This is your interior world refusing to be sold cheaply. And what does this look like from the outside during those years of non-arrival? It looks like being behind. It looks like confusion. It looks like wrong turns and false starts and seasons of producing nothing visible. It looks like the kind of life that makes well-meaning relatives ask uncomfortable questions at family dinners. But underneath the surface something is happening that has no external measurement. The late bloomer is fermenting. Think about what fermentation actually is. Grape juice becomes wine not through speed, not through effort, but through controlled decomposition. The sugars break down. The structure changes. Time is not just a variable in fermentation. Time is the active ingredient. You cannot rush it. You cannot hack it. You cannot optimize fermentation with a better morning routine. The late bloomer is the wine. And the world holding a stopwatch has spent years asking why the juice has not turned yet. As if impatience ever produced anything worth drinking. Here is where the neuroscience enters. And this is the part the productivity industry will never tell you because it dismantles their entire business model. Research in adult neuroplasticity published in journals like Nature Reviews Neuroscience has confirmed something Jung intuited a century before brain scanning existed. The human brain does not finalize in adolescence. It continues restructuring itself well into the 5th, 6th, and 7th decades of life. In the first half of life, neural development is additive. You are acquiring skills and languages and social scripts. The brain is building outward. But in the second half, the dominant neural process shifts. It becomes integrative. The brain begins connecting regions that were previously working in isolation from each other. The prefrontal cortex, which governs long-range planning and complex judgment, does not peak until the late 40s in many individuals. Pattern recognition deepens with age, not despite neural change, but because of it. The late bloomer is not working with a slower version of the same brain. They are working with a fundamentally different instrument. An instrument that is less impressive at memorizing vocabulary lists and more powerful at understanding what the vocabulary actually means. Less capable of sprinting and more capable of knowing which direction to run and why, and whether it is worth running at all. Researchers studying creativity across the lifespan have identified two distinct creative profiles. The first is the conceptual innovator, someone who produces breakthrough work early through bold rule-breaking ideas. Your prodigies, your Mozarts, your Zuckerbergs, they peak young and often plateau. The second is the experimental innovator, someone whose best work emerges later, built not on sudden inspiration but on accumulated trial and error and revision and a lifetime of quietly observed patterns. These innovators do not decline with age, they ascend. And here is the fact that should make you pause. Experimental innovators outnumber conceptual innovators in virtually every field that has been studied. The majority of the work that reshapes civilization comes from people who were nobody until they were 40 or 50 or 60. But the culture only tells you about the first type because youth is photogenic and early genius makes a better story. And the myth of the young prodigy conveniently excuses an economy built on burning people out before they are 35. Let me tell you about Toni Morrison. For almost 2 decades she worked as a textbook editor. She raised 2 children alone. She wrote in the margins of her existence. Early mornings before anyone woke up. Late nights after obligations no one would ever celebrate were finally finished. She did not publish her first novel until she was 39 years old. The Bluest Eye was not a debut by a young prodigy. It was an eruption from a woman who had spent 20 years absorbing and processing and composting the raw material of human suffering into something the literary world had never encountered before. She went on to win the Nobel Prize in Literature, but not until she was 62. Every decade of her so-called delay was a layer of sediment that made the final structure possible. She could not have written Beloved at 25, not because she lacked the talent, because she lacked the specific density of lived experience, the kind of knowing that cannot be borrowed or summarized or fast-tracked. Jung himself is the most important case study. He published Psychological Types, the work that gave the world the foundation for understanding personality, at 46. He did not begin writing the Red Book, arguably his most profound personal work, until he was 38. The collected works that cemented him as one of the most influential thinkers of the 20th century were largely produced in the second half of his life. Jung was not a late bloomer by accident. His psyche required decades of integration, the painful dissolution of his early identity as Freud's most celebrated protégé, the shadow work, the confrontation with his own unconscious. Before his authentic voice could emerge, he had to lose the voice that had made him famous. And that loss, that terrifying voluntary unbecoming, is exactly what the late bloomer goes through whether they choose it or not. Jung borrowed an image from ancient mythology to describe this process. He called it the night sea journey. The myth goes like this. The sun, which represents the conscious self, sinks below the horizon each evening and enters the belly of a great sea creature. All night it travels through darkness, through the body of the monster, through deep water where no light reaches and no landmark exists and no guarantee of morning is visible, and in the morning it rises again. But it does not rise unchanged. The sun that emerges at dawn is not the same sun that set the evening before. It has been digested, transformed, rebuilt from the inside. This is what is happening during the years you have been apologizing for. The confusion, the false starts, The seasons where nothing visible was being produced, those were not empty years. Those were the belly of the whale. You were not being destroyed, you were being digested, broken down into your most essential components so that you could be reassembled around a center that is actually yours, instead of one that was handed to you by the world before you had the capacity to evaluate whether it fit. The night sea journey is not optional for the person who is going to live an authentic life. You cannot skip it, you cannot optimize it, you cannot delegate it to a coach or a course or a better weekly planning system. You have to go through the darkness yourself. And most people do everything in their power to avoid this. They medicate, they distract, they build louder and shinier versions of the old persona just to escape the one question that waits in the dark. Who am I when no one is watching and no one is applauding and no external result exists to prove that I matter? When the late bloomer finally arrives, the arrival does not look like what most people imagine. There is no viral moment, no sudden explosion, no triumphant public reveal. The emergence is quiet in the same way that a tree growing through concrete is quiet. No one notices until the sidewalk is cracked and the roots are too deep to remove. But there is a quality that arrives with the late bloomer that is almost impossible to fake. Jung called it the self with a capital S. Not the ego, not the persona, not the highlight reel. The self is the totality, light and shadow integrated, ambition and acceptance held in the same hand. The capacity to be fully present without needing the room to confirm that you matter. People feel this quality when they encounter it. They cannot always name it, but they feel a density in the late bloomer's presence that is different from charisma and different from confidence. It is the weight of someone who has been taken apart and put back together by their own hands, not by the world's approval, not by external validation, by their own hands in the dark. And the knowing that comes from that process does not raise its voice. It does not need to. It has been tested where no audience existed. What survives that test is real. Everything before it was preparation. The late bloomer does not chase opportunities because they have seen enough false ones to recognize the difference. They do not compete with the young and fast because they are operating on a different axis entirely, one where speed is irrelevant and substance is the only currency that matters. They do not need to perform certainty because they have earned it in the one place you can only earn it. In the years when nothing was going right and they stayed anyway. Jung wrote something near the end of his life that I want you to sit with. He said the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, not who your parents needed, not who the economy demanded, not who the algorithm rewarded. Who you are when every mask has been removed and every borrowed identity has been returned and every false self has been buried with the respect it deserves for getting you this far, but with the clarity to know it can carry you no further. That is the one thing every late bloomer shares. Not talent, not luck, not a sudden breakthrough. A willingness to stop building on a foundation that was never theirs. A willingness to lose the life that was expected in order to find the life that was actually possible. A willingness to stay in the belly of the whale long enough for the transformation to complete itself instead of climbing out early and calling it done. Your strange timeline was not a deficiency. Your refusal to settle was not confusion. Your inability to build on a foundation that felt wrong was not weakness. It was your psyche protecting something so valuable that it refused to let you spend it on the wrong life. The delay was not the problem. The delay was the preparation. And the only question that remains now is not whether you are ready. The question is whether you are willing to stop apologizing for a journey that was always going to take exactly this long. The whale does not apologize for the depth of the ocean, and neither should you.